It happened while I was lying in a hospital bed, watching the ceiling lights blur into one another like distant stars. I remember the smell of antiseptic, the soft click of nurses' shoes, and the quiet rustle of sheets as I shifted, alone. My hip had shattered after a fall on the back step, and the surgery left me groggy, slow, and a little less myself. When I finally came home, 3 weeks later, the guest room, the one I had helped wallpaper with tiny green vines, the one I once filled with toys for my grandson, wasn't mine anymore. There were voices in the hallway. Not my son's. Not my grandson's. Different voices. The voice was softer, foreign accented, and slightly louder than the walls could accommodate. The scent of unfamiliar spices floated in from the kitchen. And when I looked around really hard, I realized my teacups were gone. My chair was gone. The old Afghan I had kept by the reading nook had disappeared. They hadn't cleaned. They had replaced. I thought we talked about this, he said later, not looking me in the eye. It made sense. Parents needed somewhere to stay, and we thought it'd be nice for them to have a proper room. They'll be more comfortable in the garage suite anyway. More privacy. That was the moment. I'm Helen Booker. I'm 69 years old. And that was the moment I knew my place in my son's life had quietly expired like milk gone sour behind a closed refrigerator door. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. The garage suite. A narrow, converted space behind the house, built for storage or maybe a college guest over the summer. Cold in winter, stuffy in heat. It had a kitchenette with a fridge no bigger than a suitcase, and a bed that creaked like it wanted to forget its own weight. Stood in that doorway with my hospital bag still hanging from my wrist and realized that everything I had assumed about home was wrong. Not once had he asked me. Not once had they said, "Would this be okay, Mom?" It wasn't even betrayal that I felt first. It was erasure. I didn't cry. Not then. I placed my bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall where my old sewing table used to be. I didn't hear birds that morning. Just a dull ringing in my ears and the quiet tick of the wall clock I'd bought when he was still a teenager. I remembered the time I broke my ankle when he was 9. He sat on the couch beside me every day after school, reading out loud while I dozed now. I came home from surgery to find the space I'd known replaced by strangers. There were small boxes in the hallway, not mine, labeled in a language I couldn't read. Someone had set down a mat by the front door, one I'd never seen before. I had been rewritten, not moved out, not thrown out. Absorbed as though I were now just another object to manage, another thing to put somewhere out of the way. He brought me a bowl of soup that evening. I thanked him. I ate half. My stomach turned. That night I couldn't sleep. The mattress dipped at the wrong angle, and the moonlight filtered in through cheap blinds that didn't quite close. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something slower, quieter, sinking. Not like drowning, more like drifting down through layers of memory, realizing how far I'd fallen from where I used to stand in his life. I used to be the person he came to for everything. Now I was a logistical problem he'd solved without asking. And the thing, as I knew how it would sound if I said it aloud. He's doing his best. He's stressed. It's only temporary. I could already hear the excuses that would protect him from the truth of what he'd done, but I didn't need anyone else to see it. I saw it clearly enough for all of us. I raised him on quiet love, the kind that doesn't take pictures, kind that folds laundry without being asked, picks up the late-night cough medicine, and reheats dinner twice without complaint. He was born in the middle of an April rainstorm. I remember because the power went out at the hospital, and a nurse brought in a lamp that cast soft golden light on his face. He came into the world blinking and frowning like he already understood how hard it might be to live in it. I was 24. His father had left before he learned how to walk, so it was just us. For years, just the two of us. I worked nights at the call center and mornings at the elementary school lunch counter. I remember slipping out at 4 a.m. in winter, leaving notes on the fridge, eggs on the second shelf, toasts in the oven. "I love you," I made his Halloween costumes from scratch. I stitched felt wings onto a puffer jacket one year so he could be a bat. I sold my wedding ring to pay for his braces. There was a month we almost lost the apartment. I remember feeding him peanut butter crackers for dinner and telling him it was an indoor picnic. He never knew. That's the point. I protected him from the weight of how much it cost to give him the life I did when he got accepted to university. I cried in the stairwell, not in front of him. I wanted him to think it was normal to go, that he belonged there. I packed his boxes. I drove the U-Haul. I stood in his dorm room while he half listened and said he'd call. He called less than I expected. But that's what they all do, don't they? They grow, they stretch, and they forget the hands that lifted them. Still, I sent care packages, soups and socks and pens with his favorite team logo. I sent birthday cards with a crisp bill tucked inside, even when I didn't have much to spare. When he brought home his fiancée, I smiled. I made her tea. I asked about her parents. I nodded when she talked about new traditions. I offered them the larger bedroom. When they moved in temporarily to save for a house, temporarily turned into 3 years. I bit my tongue. When she redecorated the living room, I stepped aside when they needed the kitchen on holidays. I gave them space, always space. When their son was born, I stayed up nights to rock him. I sang lullabies that my mother had sung to me. I changed sheets after he was sick. I held him when he was teething, when his mother had meetings, and when my son was too worn out to rise from the couch. They called me a blessing, until I became a burden. That shift is slow, but you feel it first. They stop asking for your opinion. Then they stop listening when you offer it anyway. Then, finally, they decide what's best for you is. If you were furniture with feelings, and I accepted it because I remembered every moment that came before, every sacrifice. Every night spent at the foot of his childhood bed, pressing a cool cloth to his fevered skin. I told myself love meant giving, but I didn't realize I had never taught him how to give back. When I broke my hip, I apologized to them. I said, I'm sorry for the trouble. He said, don't worry, we'll figure it out. Okay, and they did, by moving me out, by moving her parents in. No conversation, no warning, no, how do you feel? It's just a changed lock on a changed door in the same house. But I stayed quiet because I remembered his first steps. Because I remembered how he used to fall asleep on my shoulder after nightmares. I harbored the hope that he might also recall his first steps. It wasn't the room. It wasn't the box of my belongings placed neatly on the edge of the mattress in the garage suite. It wasn't the new shoes outside my old door or the sound of another woman praying softly in a language. I didn't speak the pattern. The slow, steady hum of shrinking was the focal point. It started long before the hospital. The first time I noticed it, really noticed it, was during a dinner 2 years ago. We'd just finished eating roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad I'd prepared on. My grandson reached for a second slice of pie. His mother took the plate from him and said, gently but firmly, no, Grandma already gave you too much sugar this week, Grandma, as if I wasn't sitting right there. They spoke around me more and more, not cruelly, just as if I were another fixture of the house. The microwave, a porch light. When they had company, I wasn't introduced. When they had plans, I wasn't told. On holidays, I was present, but never included in the photos. Why don't you take the picture, ma'am? They'd say, always with a smile. 100 quiet hurts, like the day they came home from an outing, shopping bags in hand, and I asked what they'd bought. She said, oh, just things for the house. I found out later they'd renovated the upstairs bathroom. I wasn't told or the week they all went to the mountains. It's family trip. My grandson posted pictures online, all grins and hikes and matching scarves. No one had mentioned they were going. I stayed home and watched the neighbor's cat walk across the snow-covered fence. There were changes to the kitchen, too. My spices moved to a plastic bin in the laundry room. We're just simplifying. She said, too many extras. They bought new plates, sleek, white. Mine disappeared one day without a word. I found my old china wrapped in newspaper. wedged behind a box of winter clothes in the garage. That's how it goes. You don't lose everything in one dramatic gesture. You lose it in inches. The birthday card that's from all of us, but has only one name inside. The way they start checking with each other. Instead of asking you, the eye roll when you ask for help setting the television remote. Once, I asked my grandson how school was going. He said, fine, without looking up. She called from the kitchen. He's tired, Mom. Maybe later. Maybe later. The most common way a person like me is dismissed. It wasn't that I was unloved. I know they loved me in their way. But love without respect is just a story people tell themselves to sleep at night. And I had been living inside that story too long. Even my body began to reflect it. I started slouching more and speaking less. I second-guessed everything from how. I arranged the towels to whether I was supposed to sit at the table or wait to be invited. I felt like a tenant in a home I once paid the down payment on. I kept making excuses. I told myself they were busy, stressed, that I was being sensitive. But it's a special kind of loneliness being erased in your own home. And you begin to go silent. Not because you have nothing to say, but because, no one's really listening. One evening, I sat on the porch. The light was soft. The wind carried the scent of basil from the garden. I heard them laughing inside, just the three of them. My name wasn't spoken. My chair at the table was already pushed in. That's when I realized the situation wasn't an accident. This was the result of choices. Not one choice, but 100 small ones. The kind that carve you out of the picture slowly, cleanly, without blood. It was a folded document slipped into a pile of mail on the side table that finally told me, without softness or pretense, what I had become. I had just returned from a physiotherapy appointment. My coat still damp from the rain. I spotted the envelope while setting down the Kizan off-white triangle wedged between a flyer for mattress sales and a school fundraiser brochure. It was from the property office at first. I thought it might be a tax update or a utilities notice, but something about the weight of the envelope felt different. Inside, a form confirming the transfer of title. The house, the very one I had helped my son purchase years ago. When I used part of my retirement fund to give him a down payment, was no longer in his name alone. It had been restructured legally, now shared between him and his in-laws, not as tenants. Not as guests. Co-owners. I read it 3 times. Then I looked up and realized the house no longer felt like it was breathing with me in it. It had a new rhythm, a new pulse. One that skipped over me. He never told me. There had been no discussion, no request, just signatures. And mine was not among them. That night I barely slept. I sat on the edge of the bed in the garage, the same bed I had been placed in after the hospital. Like an afterthought tucked into storage and listened to the walls hum with unfamiliar voices. I remembered the day we first stood in the empty living room. My son had just turned 30. He looked so proud, so certain. He said, "This place will be ours forever." I had believed him. I had believed in the permanence of family, in the memory of sacrifice, in the kind of bond that couldn't be overwritten by convenience. But they had crossed the final line, not because of legality, not because of property, but because they had made the decision together. Without even the courtesy of telling me, they had divided the house like I was already gone. I walked the rooms. The next morning, before anyone was awake, my grandson's school books were on the kitchen table. The walls had been repainted a cooler tone, gray-blue. The photos on the hallway shelf had changed. Their wedding portrait, her parents smiling by the sea, and a new family trip I hadn't been invited on. I wasn't in a single frame. The only trace of me was a wooden spoon I recognized in the drawer, the one with the worn handle. I'd used since he was a boy. I took it not out of spite, but because it was mine, and I knew then clearly, finally, that I needed to leave. Not in a rush, not in anger, but with the same quiet resolve I had used all my life. I called a friend from church. She knew a woman with a small back cottage available. For rent, 1 bedroom, a patch of garden, and a window that faced east for morning light. I scheduled a meeting with a solicitor. I reviewed my name on every document I could find. I requested copies. I made changes. I didn't tell them. I packed at night, one drawer at a time, folding each thing as if preparing to vanish, because, in a way, I already had. I had been erased, but now I would complete the job myself, on my terms. Leaving wasn't theatrical. There was no slam door, no confrontation in the kitchen. Just a morning like any other, soft with light and the smell of someone else's coffee. I left before anyone woke up. A neighbor helped me move the boxes, not many, just the pieces of myself that still felt like mine. A photo or two, some winter clothes, and a recipe tin filled with old handwritten cards. The wooden spoon I'd taken from the drawer. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. I left. A note, not because they deserved one, but because I did. "Don't worry," I wrote. "This isn't a protest, it's a release. Take care." Then I turned off my phone. Not forever. Just for the quiet I needed. The first night in the cottage was strange. The silence rang louder than expected. There were no footsteps overhead, no murmurs in the hallway, and no faint hum of another life happening just behind mine. Just the kettle, the creak of the floorboards, and the soft wind brushing the curtains. It was the kind of silence I hadn't allowed myself in years. I slept deeply. In the days that followed, I didn't check messages. I didn't open the family group thread. I didn't respond to the missed calls that started arriving by the second day. They weren't worried. They were surprised, because I had never gone silent before. For 69 years, I had been the one who filled the gaps, the one who apologized first, who remembered birthdays, who patched arguments, who said "don't worry about me" so often that it became my signature. But silence through silence was something they had never seen from me, and it was the most powerful thing I'd ever done. I used to believe that love meant never withholding. That silence was punishment. That distance was cruelty. But now I understood. Silence can also be a boundary. A soft, firm line drawn not out of spite, but out of knowing you've said everything that could be said. I started reading again. Long books, the kind I used to lose. Whole weekends in before my time became borrowed by other people's needs. I cooked for one simple things: toast with jam, soup from scratch. I learned the sounds of the new space. How the pipes groaned when I ran hot water. How the windows ticked softly in the wind. How the birds nested right under the roofline. I didn't miss the noise of the old house. I missed the idea of it, what it had once been, what I had built with my hands and held with my whole heart. But the reality had changed long before I walked out. I sat with that truth, and I let it settle in my silence. I did things I hadn't done in years. I went to the library. I visited the community center and signed up for a watercolor class. I went whole days without being anyone's mother, anyone's problem, anyone's afterthought. And strangely, I didn't feel erased anymore. I felt present. I didn't need to explain why I left. They knew. They just didn't think I would do it. The first thing I did was buy a new mug. It sounds small, but after a life spent drinking tea from chipped hand-me-downs or whatever was left clean, choosing a mug for myself felt quietly radical. White porcelain, thin handle. They painted a single red line around the rim. It felt like mine the moment I saw it. That mug became a ritual, steeping a bag of strong as Sam, sitting in the stillness, both hands wrapped around the heat. Small declaration. I'm here. Thing, this moment is mine. I moved differently after. I left not in the way that people talk about when they move cities or change their names. My shift wasn't outward, it was internal. I stopped explaining myself. If someone asked why I no longer lived with my son, I simply said it was time. And that was true. Time had run its course. The little cottage grew into a home slowly. I found a soft blanket at a charity shop. Margarita woman I met in watercolor class gave me a potted fern for my windowsill. A week later, I painted the door pale yellow, just because I wanted to. I had forgotten what it felt like to make decisions that didn't pass through someone else first. My life had been on hold for an extended period, not due to a lack of freedom, but rather because I had relinquished it, gradually believing I was being beneficial. Now I found myself asking questions I hadn't dared in years. What do I want? How do I feel? Where do I go from here? I joined a small walking group that met on Thursday mornings by the river. I brought shortbread one week, and no one asked me to serve. They just thanked me and passed the tin around with warmth. That kind of unspoken respect felt new and necessary. I changed my will, sat down with a calm, steady solicitor and reviewed every line. Removed names, added new ones. A niece who'd called me every birthday without fail. A friend who once brought me soup during the flu without being asked. No fanfare. It's just truth. I wasn't cutting anyone out for revenge. I was choosing peace. I received a letter from my son in late March. The letter was not handwritten, but rather typed, formal and unsigned. I understand you needed space. Please let us know if you want to talk. Want to? Not needed. Not miss. Just logistics. I didn't write back because I no longer needed him to understand. That was the biggest shift of all. I had stopped needing them to see me in order to feel real. I stopped waiting for apologies that wouldn't come. I stopped offering explanations for my absence because I wasn't missing. I had simply stepped into a version of my life where I was finally at the center. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just done with shrinking to fit into rooms I once built. Done with bending my needs to protect their comfort. And done with waiting to be chosen by people who had long since chosen convenience over connection. Now I choose myself. Every morning I make tea. I open the window. I sit in the quiet and say, without words, the world is mine. At first, it was quiet on their end too. I suppose they expected I'd come back, call after a few days, apologize somehow, or ask for help, but I didn't. And in that silence, something began to shift, not just in me, but in them. I heard about it through others, never directly. A woman from church saw my son at the market. She said he looked tired, like someone constantly trying to explain something no one had asked about. My grandson, who used to call me every Saturday to tell me about science projects and soccer wins, stopped calling, not by his own doing. I think children don't forget you unless they're taught to. What they lost without me wasn't just help around the house, or a warm meal, or an extra set of hands during illness. They lost the cushion, the presence that caught the small things. Before they spilled, the person who remembered birthdays and planned meals that worked around everyone's preferences. The one who adjusted quietly when someone else's plans changed. They lost the stabilizer. I used to refill the paper in the printer, make sure the dishwasher was emptied before they woke, and restock the medicine cabinet before anyone noticed. It was empty. I never called it work. It was just what I did. Until I stopped. I heard that the in-laws didn't get on as smoothly as they expected. Her mother didn't like the cold. Her father left the bathroom window open, even in winter. There were disagreements about groceries. It's about space. About volume. The house, once humming with a quiet rhythm I had learned to follow without stepping on toes, was now clumsy with too many footsteps in the wrong places. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't watching like someone waiting to be proven right. But I did see it clearly. From a distance, the soft unraveling of things once held together by invisible threads. Threads I had tied, and when those threads slipped, I began to notice the lack of grace. Not the religious kind, the kind that makes a home run without complaint. The kind that fills the sugar jar when it's low. Catches the glance of a child across a room and knows whether it means tired, hungry, or please help. They lost that, and I think slowly they started to feel it. Not just in chores or logistics, but in the quiet, the space I once held. The way I softened the sharpness between them. The way I stood between her short temper and his stubborn streak. I had been the buffer, the witness. I was the one who recalled their origins and showed them respect even when they forgot. They lost the person who remembered everything, not because I kept score, but because I cared. I understood who had preferences, who required personal space, and the significance of each day. Now, there were forgotten appointments, misunderstandings, missed calls. The house went on, of course. They're not helpless, but something in it sagged. And from where I stood in my small yellow-doored cottage, with its garden coming back to life, I could see it not as revenge, but as balance, not punishment, just the natural gravity of absence. Because when a person has been a quiet anchor in your life, you don't feel the pull until the tide goes out. And when it does, you're left standing on wet sand, blinking in the strange light, wondering how you didn't notice the current that held you steady was no longer there. I had no intention of writing to him. Not for months. Silence was its own language, and I thought I had said enough with my leaving. But one morning, early spring, soft mist on the windows, I sat down at my little writing desk and found my hand resting on a sheet of thick paper, not shaking, not uncertain, just ... still. I don't know what pulled it from me. Maybe it was the way the birds were calling outside. Maybe it was the tulips poking through the thawed garden bed. It could have been a quieter release that had been building in my chest, waiting for the right moment. And I began not with anger, not with accusation, but with honesty. I want you to know, I wrote, that I did not leave out of rage. I left because I finally realized my presence had become invisible or inconvenient, and I couldn't hold that anymore. The words poured out slowly, like a long-held breath easing out through my fingertips. I told him about the moment in the hospital, about coming home to find my life rearranged without me, about how I stared at a room that used to be mine only to find it stripped of every softness I'd added through the years. I told him how it wasn't just the bed, or the blinds, or the new names on the title deed. It was the knowing. They had decided I was something to be stored. And how? When I realized that when I finally accepted it, I felt something unhook inside me. I raised you with every ounce of softness I had. I wrote, I made you my purpose, my center. And when you grew, I made myself small to give you more room. But one day I looked around and realized there was no space left for me at all. I told him I wasn't writing an apology, that I didn't want explanations or clarifications or a list of all the reasons they thought it made sense. I didn't need them to understand me anymore. I just wanted to leave behind a truth. I wrote before I closed the door for good. I told him I still loved the boy he once was, the one who ran to me in the schoolyard with skinned knees and 1,000 questions. But I no longer needed anything from the man who had stood beside me in that hospital room and never thought to ask if I felt safe, or wanted, or at home. I signed it simply, not Mom, not with love, just Helen. Because in that moment, I wasn't writing as his mother. I was writing as myself. I was a woman who had given for decades without keeping track of receipts, but who had finally realized that even unconditional love requires a vessel, and mine had emptied. I sealed the envelope, no address, no stamp. I didn't intend to send it. Instead, I folded it into thirds and slipped it into the garden journal I keep by the WINDOWSILL. I left it there, not as a message to him, but as a marker in my life. That was the day I released the last thread that tied me to being needed in a way that cost me my voice. That was the day I said goodbye, not to him, but to the version of me that had waited for too long. There's a rhythm to my days now. I wake early, without the need for alarms. The light comes in through the east-facing window, soft and golden, casting long lines across the floorboards I swept the night before. I boil the kettle, pour the tea, sit in the same chair by the window, and listen to birds, to wind, to the sound of a world that no longer asks too much of me. There's peace in it, not the loud, triumphant kind, just the peace of enough. The cottage is small, but it holds me perfectly. The rooms remember my footsteps. The books remember my hands. The garden remembers my care. I've planted parsley and mint along the fence, tomatoes in the raised bed. The hydrangeas came back after all pale blue, just like the ones I used to grow before they tore up the backyard to build a deck I was never invited to sit on. Margaret drops by sometimes with scones. We sit under the pergola and talk about nothing of consequence, which, in its own way, is everything. She once said, "You seem lighter now." And I am, not because I've forgotten, but because I no longer carry it all in the same way. I still think of him sometimes. My son, I wonder if he ever walks into the garage suite and feels a pause like something missing. I wonder if my grandson ever asks where I went or why no one says my name as often. But I don't linger there. I think of them the way you think of a home you once lived in, grateful for what it gave you, but certain you were right to leave. Don't need to be part of their picture anymore, because I built one of my own. One with wild mint and yellow paint and silence that feels like music. I journal most evenings now. I don't always write much. Sometimes just a single line. Yesterday, I wrote the following: I am not waiting anymore. Not for calls, not for understanding, not for space at a table I helped build. There's freedom in that, in knowing that the quiet you feared was loneliness is, in fact, the beginning of your own voice returning to you. I'm not rich in the ways the world counts, but I am full of mornings with no demands, full of tea that never grows cold, full of days that begin and end on my terms. And when people ask if I'm upset, I say, no. Anger is heavy. I'm light now. I wasn't pushed away. I walked out. I walked out. I wasn't forgotten. I stepped out of sight. I wasn't erased. I turned the page. And in that last line of my life's letter, I find myself again. I wasn't angry, was finally empty, and that was beautiful.